Hey everybody, welcome back to Choosers of the Slain. I'm Nate.
And I'm Lucas.
And today we are coming back to talk about a couple of data sheets that we had discussed last week. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about warp spiders, and Lucas is going to be talking about the Ruckatruck Squig Buggy. And it was an interesting week, or a couple of weeks looking over those, but ultimately it's led us to think that maybe we should have a broader discussion on kind of how do we evaluate units and some of the pitfalls when it comes to evaluating those units and how you might use them in the game and comparing them to other units and that sort of thing. But it's been a slow news week, so I think we'll just hop right into it. Lucas, what were your thoughts on the Squig Buggy?
So something that kind of stood out to me with it is that it falls into the kind of classical trap that some of the various units have had throughout all of 40K's history, and a lot of miniature war gamings have this, or miniature war games have this, where they want a lot of variety in the lists. They want like creative, cool things, but just not everything can be like the end all be all.
Sure.
And this kind of, at passing glance, this looks like it's one of those, like what you would call like a fluff unit. Like we just want more stuff in the codex, and this is characterful and it fits the orcs. But I do think, kind of to your greater point of, depending on the perspective you use when you're trying to dissect the value of something, if you're willing to kind of step outside the box or to consider more things than kind of the standard plug and play approach to things, I think there is a lot more value in some of these like side grade units or less stellar units. And I will have to admit, I think the Ruckatruck Squig Buggy struggles enough statistically that you do have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics to pull it out of a nosedive. But I think that there is a use for it. I think there's a place for it. But it definitely does not scream easy mode. That's my kind of broad overview of it. We can, as we get into the discussion about how we parse that whole conversation out, I mean, I can go into more specifics, but what's your broad overview on the warp spiders?
So I kind of came to a similar conclusion, which was pretty disheartening. I'm a big fan of all things Aspect Warrior, and warp spiders are one of my favorites. But you kind of get into this issue where to really make them shine, you have to have a specific use for them, in terms of utilizing their mobility more than anything. But that kind of reaches into something else that we'll talk about a little bit more too, and that's when you're looking at a unit and looking at what other units do that same job. When it comes down to it, the warp spiders have some good things they can do, but there are other units that can do it better within the Eldar Codex, and I think that's kind of where they struggle, at least, is can you make them work if you have warp spiders laying around and that's what you want to use? Yeah, there are ways you can make them work, sure. Are they maybe the most efficient or the best way to fill that role in your army? Probably not, but we can get more into what that looks like. So.
Well, you had brought up comparison, kind of comparing things to their competition within the codex. One thing that I know kind of stands out to me when people are weighing a data sheet and its value or its usefulness, is there's kind of like a pitfall of comparing it to equivalently costed things in other codexes, or comparing things to like their what seems to be their design counterpart. If you have a land speeder in a Space Marines army, you might naturally want to compare it to a Piranha in the Tau army, or you might want to compare it to like a I guess you could say like a Star Weaver in the Harlequins, or a Void Weaver, not Star Weaver, that's the transport. But the comparisons are much more nuanced, and also a lot of times the point values for units are not entirely based on their comparison to other factions.
Right.
Sometimes the point values are as much informed by their comparison to other things within their own codex. And so I think a thing that when you're comparing stuff to its quote unquote competition, keeping that point that you brought up of making sure to think of the unit in terms of other things within the faction that are competing for your points or your battlefield role slots is much more useful to you as a player and as a list writer than it is to get hung up on, well, that's unfair because the Tau get a unit that does the same thing for 50 points less, or the Space Marines have something that does exactly the same thing as this but has a 3+ armor save. I think it's really easy to kind of get down on a unit because of that pitfall. And I really like that you pointed out like that internal comparison component.
Yeah, and there's a good analog to Magic the Gathering in there, and I know I've made a couple different comparisons between 40K and that, but one of the really nice things about Magic, at least for a large part of its history, has been the designers have been quite transparent about why they do the things they do and how they do the things they do, and their methodology and everything. And I think one of the things you see there is the idea that different. If we look at each color in Magic as a faction in Warhammer 40K, different colors, it costs different things to do in them. So like you might spend 2 mana on trample in green, but it's going to be 3 mana on trample in red because those colors don't have as easy access to it, or the other tools that they have in their toolkit make having that ability stronger than it is elsewhere. And I think 40K has a lot of analogs there. It's if you take an Eldar army and you go, okay, great, well, should Eldar pay a premium for a unit that moves 8 in a codex where pretty much everything moves at least 7? I guess maybe a little. But if it's should you pay a premium to have a unit that's toughness 5 and has a 2+ armor save in a unit in an army that's mostly toughness 3 and sitting on 4+ or worse, yeah, that's going to be a lot more expensive.
Absolutely.
But in a Custodes army, that's par for the course.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make. It is how does this shake out with what is basically expected? Or how does this compare to what the whole point of the army is? And also what value, there's a lot of intangible or like deep synergies that happen in the back end of a list, like when it comes to what strategies do a unit have access to. And so, when you have a unit like a Space Marine unit, for instance, that has access to transhuman physiology.
Sure.
And then you look at a codex like the Imperial Guard, and you have no equivalent stratagem that just steps in and goes, half of these wounds don't wound.
Right.
Then it becomes like, okay, does looking across the Space Marine Codex, every single one of those units has this floating possibility for a 50% wound denial.
Yeah.
So then how do you balance that into the cost? And so, when you figure those kind of things in, like what other things do you have access to from your special rules, from your synergies, from, sacred rites or combat doctrines, like all of that plays into the fact where 2 units that have functionally the same stat line, functionally the same weapons, and functionally the same battlefield role might cost wildly different points because one is in a book with transhuman physiology and one is in a book without it.
Right.
Right. And I think sometimes sometimes that's forgotten as well. But at the risk of sounding like we're, soapboxing about the community's, quickness to judge things as unfair or how they argue things, we're not trying to invalidate any of the frustration people feel like when you happen to be on the wrong part of the wheel when it comes to the cycle turning over and you feel like your faction's getting run over. We definitely understand there are times in the great cycle where you just are the one who's getting the short end of the stick, and we're not at all invalidating those frustrations.
No. I mean, right now is a great example of it. If you're not a Marines Codex and arguably a Death Guard or a Necron player, but especially Space Marines, just because they're so prevalent. I mean, you're for the most part looking at things going, okay, well, I might have some tricks that make it so I can win. There are a few lists out there that do great. But overall, when you're looking at point values and looking at how rules are written and looking at everything there, like, it's clear that you're playing against a 9th edition codex with one that's just lagging a little behind. So
and that hopefully is something that will shake out in time. And it's easy to sometimes look at that and cry codex creep. I mean, we discussed that recently with Dark Angels. It kind of felt like things are a bit strong, but if you really kind of sit back and take a breath, what appears to be codex creep could also just be the vast difference between how 9th edition plays and how 8th edition plays, and how some changes that are necessary might appear at first to our sensibilities as overly powerful. And speaking of sensibilities and our preconceived notions, that's kind of what we wanted to crack open in this discussion, was the ways, very specifically the ways that we look at a data sheet to try to objectively see its value and see what its capabilities are, instead of just going like, ugh, this isn't as good as that, this is garbage. So we use those two data sheets as examples to get there. So to that end, we've talked many times about 9th edition is as important. Deployment and movement have gotten a severe shot in the arm as far as their involvement in the overall meta of the game. It's not just about murder. And I mean, movement's always been important, but now it's like really important.
Right. And
so if we know kind of 9th edition is board control, survivability, combat effectiveness, and then you have your overall miniature wargaming kind of philosophies of like target priorities and forcing your opponent into making meaningful choices, and always keeping an eye to the mission and not just to how much plastic are you moving from the table. So if we're looking from those kind of broader miniature wargaming subjects, Nate, where do you start? Like, what's your you sit down with a new data sheet or a new codex and you open the book up and you look at something. What's the first thing that you look at when you're trying to decide whether or not something's going to work?
So I think the number one thing you should look at before you even start evaluating whether you think a unit's good or not, whether you think a data sheet's good or not, anything like that, I think the first thing you need to look at is, what is this unit supposed to be doing? And sometimes what the unit's supposed to do in story, and the way that the designers wrote about it, the way Games Workshop writes about it, matches up relatively well with what the data sheet shows that it should be doing on the table. Other times, not so much. There are definitely some cases where one unit that's supposed to be this crazy, just takes on everything, can kill anything with a couple of shots, and is really just meant to wade through the battlefield killing stuff. They wind up being not all that great at killing stuff, but they're really durable and can sit on an objective and are almost impossible to shift. And that's just, you really have to look at a data sheet and go, okay, what do the stats look like? What do its weapons look like? What are the ranges? How do the special rules interact? And take that into consideration and say, okay, so all things considered, this unit is probably best suited to holding objectives, or this unit is best suited to killing light infantry or heavy infantry or anti-tank, or whatever might be the case. I talked about the list a couple weeks ago. I talked about having a push threat, this idea that you want a unit that can put quick pressure on an opponent and make sure that, you know, you're always applying pressure in one place or another. Is a unit good for that? Is a unit okay at that? But you put them in a transport and all of a sudden they're good at it. You know, you have to look at what the unit seems like it's best suited for before you start deciding if it's actually good at it.
That's an excellent place to start. I think too, kind of almost maybe the next step of that process for me is to, once you kind of do that basic overview, then saying, okay, if it seems to be failing in one area, or if it seems to not stand up to something that you're already familiar with, kind of turning the question on its head and saying, okay, I thought it should be good at this. What is it good at that I'm not? You know, instead of seeing if it is the thing you want it to be, like to force yourself to kind of step back and see it for what it is.
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest ways to do that is to remind yourself that the wounds per point that the unit puts out is only one of the many ways to mathematically, you know, determine the value of a unit.
Absolutely.
We are very quick as players to run that math hammer in our head or on a spreadsheet or on a calculator, or to read an article from a great site like Goonhammer, something, you know, something like that, where we just look at it and go, okay, this model punches at this ratio of wounds per point, and this model has a higher or a lower one. You know, just remembering that is only one thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then asking yourself, okay, is this unit here to actually kill anything?
Right.
Yeah, all models have to have rules to interact with other models because it's a miniatures game. But just because, you know, it doesn't have those rules because its job is to interact with the other models. Right. It has those rules because as a consequence of it being in the game, it has to be able to interact with those models.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, you know, to kind of force yourself to remember, like, it might be there to do exactly what Nate said, sit on an objective and be hard to shift. You may be investing in a unit that has no real interest or desire in actually killing anything. It's supposed to be in that building, not dying all game. And if it can peel a Marine or two off with random shots, or if it can, you know, have one of those miraculous, you know, tactical drone kills a Space Wolf champion kind of close combat moments, awesome. You know, then that's a fun, you know, story to share with your friends, and, you know, think back to that one time where, you know, that drone defied the odds. But you know, those are all icing on the cake. Yeah. The unit might really be there to raise banners or deploy scramblers or to screen against deep strike. And you had mentioned pressure before. You know, perception is 9/10 reality in so many ways. And so whether or not a unit is actually effective sometimes matters less than whether or not the unit seems effective.
Yep.
And so if having a unit in your list, like the proverbial distraction Carnifex, can cause your opponent to have to change what they were going to do, then that model just paid for part of its cost right there, because it took some measure of control away from your opponent. And so that is definitely, those kind of broader questions are what we would encourage people to kind of think of when, you know, you sit down with that brand new data sheet, you know, as we're going to have to do coming up with, you know, a potential Drukhari Codex in the next couple months, or with my soon to be in existence sister's weird war suit thing, and I'm gonna have to find room for it in my army. You know, we're gonna have to sit down with those data sheets and go, what does this do? Why does it do it? You know, and where can I fit you in my list? And I really personally, I really like to start with, hey, remember, not everything is in here to kill something. You know, that's my follow-up to your initial point.
Yeah, and I mean, I think a great example of that too is in our recent game, I brought a couple of bases and Nurglings, and they literally stayed in one spot the entire game, and their entire purpose was to hold an objective and try to not die. And they held that objective until turn 4?
Yeah,
I mean, it was most of the game, and Nurglings aren't going to do much in combat. Sure, against guardsmen they might, if they're backed up by a sloppity biopiper or something else. Sure, they might do something, but realistically, they're a unit that is really there just to, for lack of a better way of putting it, be annoying. Like they're
and it worked.
Yeah, they're just annoying because they're tougher than they should be. They have a sizable footprint, and even 3 of them can survive a large amount of shooting. And then there's a stratagem to bring them back. I mean, it's that kind of thing where you look at the unit and go, wow, these are terrible. Except that if you look at them from the lens of they're meant to sit on an objective, or to have a little more board control, or to really just be that kind of harassing, annoying thorn in the side kind of unit, all of a sudden they go from being terrible to, wow, it's 65, 66 points for 12 wounds of guys that have a 5+ invul and a 5+ feel no pain and are relatively low profile, so they can easily hide out of line of sight, and they have objective secured, and like all of a sudden their strength and toughness doesn't matter so much as that they can just sit there and hold stuff, and they have enough tools to not move or to get where you want them to be, that they're really good at it.
Yeah, they really are. And it's in all those intangibles, like I used that word earlier. It's in those intangibles and in the synergy that like most units really shine.
Yeah.
And if all you do is look at a data sheet and go, it has a 4 here and it says a 7 there, and it costs this many points, that's stupid.
Yeah.
Then you can miss a lot of that stuff.
Yep.
So broad general kind of philosophy aside, if we get into the nitty gritty, can you give us a kind of a rapid fire blow by blow of the capabilities and weaknesses of the Warp Spiders unit?
Yeah.
And then kind of your elevator pitch on, if you were going to use them, how would you use them?
Yeah, so Warp Spiders are, for anyone who's not familiar with the CotS, they are speed, I want to say 7, but they have a special ability where rather than advancing, they can do a what they call a warp jump, where you roll 4d6 and you add the result to their movement, and that's their movement for the turn. They can't charge after doing so, but it's functionally an advance, and that Eldar can advance, Craftworld Eldar advance without penalty and shoot assault weapons without penalty, and they do the same thing. They can't charge afterwards, whatever. But their guns are 12-inch range, strength 6, AP 0, damage 1, and then on a 6+ to wound, they are AP -4. So you got a chance at putting in some solid AP there. They're assault 2, 12-inch range, and Warp Spiders suffer from the elite infantry issue that Craftworld Eldar in particular suffer from in general, and that's that they are 1 wound toughness 3 models that, unfortunately for Warp Spiders in particular, really the big thing they have going for them is movement. There are a lot of side cases where you could use them, for quick, they can deep strike, so you can bring them in and quick put some shots down on something. You can maybe hop them back on a flank and apply a little bit of pressure. You can take some shots at a light tank. You could probably kill a rhino with them in a couple of turns without too much of a problem. Fish for those 6+ to hits. They're 3+ weapon skill, ballistic skill, aspect warriors. They're in heavy aspect armor, so at least they have a 3+ save, which is kind of a rarity in the Eldar Codex. They definitely have some pluses, but really their mobility is kind of the big thing, and that is really compounded on by some of the stratagem or some of the Exarch powers that you can take out of Psychic Awakening, Phoenix Rising. The big one for me is they have one Exarch power that allows them to essentially redeploy anywhere on the board, following normal deep strike restrictions, and that in particular, if you can keep them alive, is a great objective grab later in the game. Or if you're if you've taken line breaker or behind enemy lines or any of those where you need to take table quarters for a secondary and go, oh man, I'm missing that quarter. Well, there's some space there, so I'm just going to quick pop my warp spiders over there this turn, and that's 3 victory points or whatever it might be. So they definitely have a place there. But I think if you're looking at them purely from a perspective of how much are they going to kill and how well are they going to survive doing it, they're a tough unit to justify. They're 18 points a model. Their guns are free, so there's that. And then if you give the Exarch power blades, it's an extra 5 points. But the really tough part with them is that they are 1 wound, toughness 3. The Exarch has 2 wounds, but still toughness 3. The 3+ save helps. The utility of being able to not, to take the -1 in shooting with their flicker ability is helpful. But you risk mortal wounds with that, and even with that -1, they very quickly go down to large amounts of anti-infantry fire or close combat. And so I think really what you want to do with warp spiders, if you're going to use them, you want to keep them out of the way. You want to plop them on a backfield objective, hold it while it makes sense to, and they're there to screen a little bit. They're there to provide a little bit of a threat for anyone getting too close. Strength 6 is solid. You're wounding a lot of stuff on 2s, and most other stuff on 3s, other than bigger vehicles. So you just stick them back on an objective, and then once it gets a little later in the game, they're a board control unit. And you almost want to keep them out of combat, both melee and ranged, because
makes sense.
They're so short range that once you are in range of shooting, unless you're spending command points on fire and fade to move back that 7 inches, once you're in range to shoot with your guns, you are within charge range of the enemy, and so it's you kind of want to hide with them, and play a game of cat and mouse.
Well, speaking of that, and this plays into what we were talking about earlier about kind of looking at it through a lens of not just math hammering it. While the warp spiders are pretty chunky for Eldar standards, they're fairly close to the size of a Primaris Marine. Yeah, and so the maybe not necessarily in full proportion, but in displaced water, they're about about the size of a little bit shorter, Marine.
Smaller base.
Yeah. And so one of the first things that comes to mind for me is, a lot of tables are going to get designed to try to be a balanced matchup, or to try to block line of sight. And if the first thing that pops in everybody's head when they think 40K is a Space Marine, even though they're very, very thick and bulky for an Eldar infantry model, a lot of the tables are going to be set up for Marines.
Oh yeah. And
so small units of warp spiders that exist to stay out of line of sight and move quickly across the table and then just camp an objective, as beefy as they are for Eldar, they're still pretty small and hideable.
Yeah, the toughest thing you have to deal with is potentially their guns sticking out from stuff, because those spinners or the spinneret rifles are quite large. Yeah. But I think the warp spiders are a great example of one of those comparisons you make within a codex where, okay, you've looked at it, you've identified this realistically, this unit wants to be holding objectives. It wants to be establishing board control. It wants to be that proverbial fly in the ointment. But then you have to look at the rest of the codex and go, what else wants to do that? And is it really the best for the job? Is it good enough that it doesn't really matter? Is it pretty much on par with the other stuff, and it comes down to a matter of what else is in your list and the flavor and everything there. And with the warp spiders, that's where I really struggled. If all you have is warp spiders to fill your fast attack slot, yeah, you can use them for that, and they'll be solid at it, and you can probably play to have them be really good at it. But if you've got some jet bikes, they fill the same battlefield role and are pretty arguably better at it, and a little bit cheaper and tougher to shift.
That's fair. I run into some of the similar, like, internal codex internal conflicts with the Rocket Truck Squig Buggy.
Yeah, tell me more about that.
So the trick with the Squig Buggy is it is very pricey for a platform that does not compare it, or does not feel like that's appropriately priced. And that's, there may be situations that I cannot conceive of, or there may be some game balance things that I have not seen or experienced that it is worth that price. But I generally think it is a bit overcosted, which is challenging, much like you had said with the warp spiders. There's just better options when you compare it to other things you can get.
Yeah.
That said, I do think that there is a place for it. It's a very niche place, and there's also a risk that you are throwing good points after bad to try to prove a point.
Sure.
But the Rocket Truck Squig Buggy is one of the new-ish Orktober of yesteryear buggies that the orcs got when they got their 8th edition retreatment. And the Rocket Truck Squig Buggy is on the slower side. It is a movement 10 buggy as opposed to the 12s and 14s that some of the others have, which kind of naturally makes it a comparison for the Megatrack Scrapjet, which is arguably one of the best of the new buggies. Shock Jumps Dragster and the Megatrack Scrapjet are both really, really solid units. Yeah. And so when the Rocket Truck is the other slow one, I think it's easy to kind of think of it as like, oh, it's the tanky one. It's the, because normally there's that preconceived notion of something that is slow must be powerful.
Right.
In this case, I don't think that's the case. I think this thing is not, for some of the rules in 40K are driven by narrative, and it is just covered in orcs, and it's loaded to the gills with like squig. It's almost like a rolling dog kennel. So it makes sense to me story-wise that it's one of the slower vehicles, and I think that did influence the rules a little bit, but it has a strength. If you compare it across the kind of balance of the orc codex, it has a strength that not a lot of the orc vehicles have, which is it can reach out and touch things. The majority of its primary weapons are 36-inch range. And so I think that its 10-inch movement speed is because it, as a vehicle, it's faster than orcs on foot. It's faster than some of the like really heavy tanks that the orcs have access to through Forge World and through the Codex. But it doesn't need to be super fast because it doesn't have 12, 16, 18, 24-inch guns. It has 36-inch guns. Its 10-inch movement is more about proper placement and being able to kind of get where you need to be, as opposed to being a speed demon that just tears across the table.
Right.
Another kind of another thing to keep in mind is that one of its special rules is that it has a Grot Gunner for its main weapon, and the main weapon, if we're really focusing on the tactical value of the Squig Buggy, really it's the squig launchers that you're the heavy squig launcher and the regular squig launcher that you care about.
Mhm.
It has an assault 2 sawed-off shotgun kind of as a secondary weapon. It has a special rule that allows it to throw one orc frag grenade equivalent, even if the other weapons are being fired. And it does have like little buzz saws that fold down on the side for, justifying it to have close combat.
Sure. Sure.
Though those saws on the side are super underwhelming. But
oh boy.
So it has some secondary weapons, but really the real meat and potatoes of it is a 36-inch range squig launcher. The heavy squig launcher is not more powerful. It is effectively a twin squig launcher. The difference between the heavy and the regular is just the heavy shoots twice as many times.
Okay.
So really it has 3 squig launchers.
It's a lot of squigs.
It is. It's a whole truckload of them. Very literally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a multi-profile weapon. The squig launcher is 36-inch range. I can't remember the name of it. It is the bile squig, is a poison weapon. So it's assault 2d6, strength star, AP nothing, 1 damage, and all non-vehicle and non-titanic units it wounds on a 4-up, and then vehicle and titanic units it wounds on a 6-up, kind of like a Drukhari poison weapon. Or a needle pistol, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Another profile is the Bitey Squig. And the Bitey Squig is, again, 36-inch range, assault 2, strength 5, AP -3, fixed 2 damage, no special rules. Okay. And then the third profile is the Boom Squig. This one, I think, imagining the math in my head, this one's the one I think most of the time you're going to use. The Boom Squig, 36-inch range again, assault 2d3, which I
a lot of shots.
Prefer to 1d6. So strength 6, AP -1, d3 damage. So it is kind of comparable to a 2d3 crack grenade launcher, if you want to think of it like a Space Marine unit. Now the real, and this, by the way, this is on a 9 wound 4+ save having toughness 6 platform.
Okay.
So it has Daka. It has Speed Mob. Speed Mob is like Lehman Russ's or Carnifex's, where you buy 1 to 3 of them as a unit and deploy them within 6 inches of each other. But then once the game starts, they break up into individual things.
Yeah, like their squadron roll.
Yeah, it blows up like a vehicle you normally would.
Okay.
Riding shotgun allows it to throw that grenade. The Grot Gunner, this is something that I think is really, this is kind of where I was going a little bit ago, and I got sidetracked talking about the weapon. The Grot Gunner is a +1 to hit roll for weapon or for attacks made with the heavy squig launcher. So the single squig launcher is fired by an orc, but the heavy squig launcher is fired by a Grot Gunner. So 2/3 of the squig launchingness is done at a 4-up, and then 1/3 is done at 5-up. So kind of that's an interesting choice that they didn't just let the Grot target for everything.
Yeah,
kind of seems a little cumbersome to have to parse out that, but something to kind of keep in mind. 2/3 of its primary weapon are fired by a Grot, which is nice in the Orc Codex.
Yeah, absolutely.
Also, it does have a once per game ability to drop a haywire style mine behind it, where where if the vehicle moves, you can place a squig mine somewhere that it moved over, and then if an enemy unit gets within a certain range of it, then you roll. It does nothing, or it does 1 mortal wound or D3 mortal wounds. So it is your kind of standard deployable one-use mine.
Yeah.
Rule. A lot of the armies have something like that. It's got that as well, it's nice. But with that 10-inch movement, and with what I'm about to say about the tactics of it, that ability kind of feels like a little bit of a red herring.
Okay.
Because you look at it, you're like, oh, cool, it could drop a mortal wound mine, but I don't think you're sending this thing out into the field.
Okay.
And so that mine is, I guess maybe if you drop it in a tasty spot of your own deployment zone at the start of the game as kind of like a counter deep strike or a counter charge defense, I guess that has value. But
Sure.
I don't see you aggressively hurting the battlefield with it. So the talked about the range of its weapon.
Yeah.
A lot of within the Orc Codex, there is kind of a propensity for things to be either buckets of dice, ineffective, but there's a million orcs, so it's effective through volume, or it is high risk, high reward gambles. You have your shock attack guns that are they either work really, really well or not at all. Or you conversely, you have a mob of 30 shooter boys with 3 big shooters hiding in it so that you can just, literally send your opponent to the hospital under an avalanche of dice.
Quantity has a quality all its own.
Absolutely. And so a lot of things in the Orc Codex tend to shake into those two things. And this is where the Squig Buggy is a bit of an outlier. It in my assessment, it kind of fills that jack of all trades, master of none.
Okay. Yeah.
It's not the fastest fast attack choice that you have. Its anti-tank weapon, the Boom Squig, is not the best. It's not a rocket launcher that fires 3d6 strength 8 crack missiles. Its anti-infantry is even the anti-infantry weapon it has that is the best for hordes. That poison weapon is a random number of shots.
Yeah.
So it's not the best at any one category, but unlike a lot of other orc vehicles, it can shift, on the fly.
Yeah.
And also the fact that it's got a 36-inch range, even if its anti-armor or anti-elite infantry weapons are kind of behind the ball or behind the curve compared to like rocket launches or compared to like custom mega blasters within the codex, the fact that it can reach out to 36 inches is a big deal.
Yeah.
And something that I kind of forced myself to realize in the use of my Space Marine Storm Speeder in the last couple weeks, seeing fast movement on a model and not immediately thinking in aggressive terms, is handy to kind of to look at that and go, okay, this unit moves really, really fast. Do I need to go at the enemy with this, or can I flank with it, or can I retreat with it? Well, an orc vehicle that has a 36-inch range on a relatively interesting weapon, I don't know that I can call it good, but it's certainly an interesting weapon. To have that 36-inch range and a 10-inch movement, you could just constantly keep the enemy at that like 34 to 36-inch range.
Yeah. So
that you're only eating their primary fire back, and all of your weapons of note can still be used. So I think there's value in that, and that's what I see its place being. I see it as a flanking harassment Swiss Army knife.
Yeah, I can see that.
I would argue that you're primarily going to use the Boom Squig stat line, which is the strength 6, the kind of crack grenade one. And here's why. The vehicle it's a little overcosted. It's 110 points. And so I personally am not seeing a single one being that useful. I'm thinking if you're going to do it, go whole hog and bring a unit of 3. And the reason why I would do that is the only supporting stratagem or special rule that it really has beyond universal orc stuff is there's a custom job in Saga of the Beast that allows a unit of rocket truck squig buggies to get a +1 to the wound rolls of their squig launchers. It's a custom job called Nitro Squigs. And the Saga of the Beast does specify that if you give custom job to a unit that breaks up into multiple units during deployment, that all of them keep the custom job. So for one command point, you can give all 3 Rucka Truck Squig Buggies in that fast attack slot +1 to wound with their primary or with the Squig launcher, their main weapon.
That's solid.
And this, yeah, and I think that's probably the saving grace. It is a little frustrating that that's the only one of the buggies that does not have its own stratagem. A lot of the other buggies have, like, last ditch moves or like crazy quirky things that they can do. The Squig Buggy just doesn't. But the that custom job, I think, is pretty solid. And if you look at the math of it, the boom squig, which is functionally a crack grenade, because it's strength 6, the only things that it cannot wound on a 5+ are toughness 12, which is basically unheard of.
Yeah.
And so with a +1 on the wound roll, anything that is strength 7 or toughness 7 to toughness 10, you're wounding on a 4 up, because it's going to mechanically be a 5 up, and then you'll +1 to the wound roll.
Right.
That functionally means that for that custom job, that weapon is kind of gaining a special rule that says its strength scales to the toughness of its target.
Right.
And so for a 36-inch range multi-shot that uses D3s instead of D6s, so you have less variance and a higher floor for number of shots. The having a weapon like that in an orc codex, or in the orc codex, is actually kind of rare.
Yeah.
To say, like, okay, this is a mediocre anti-armor weapon that gets a solid number of shots at a longer range. I mean, rocket launchers only go 24 inches.
Right.
You have to get into the custom mega cannons and stuff, or the mech guns, or what used to be called big guns batteries. You have to get into those weapons to get into like the 36 and 48-inch ranges. And the fact that 2/3 of them have +1 on the ballistic skill, or 2/3 of the shots will have +1 on the ballistic skill, that doesn't hurt.
No.
And if your opponent is running like Marines or a lot of elite infantry, you could switch to that the Bitey Squig to get the AP -3 and the fixed 2 damage. But honestly, I'm thinking if you have that +1 to wound thing going on, you're still going to be wounding Marines and things on a 2 up,
right,
with the strength 6 AP -1 D3 damage weapon. So I guess, salt to taste as to what you feel is more appropriate with the shots that you would turn on Marines. But either way, you have some pretty solid options for attacking power armor, for attacking elite, elite Eldar, elite Tau, crisis suits, things like that. You have some solid options, and you're reaching out at 36 inches to do it.
Yeah.
And if you do happen to face a horde army, the poison version, the one that shoots the multiple shots, 2d6 for the heavy and 1d6 for the light.
Yep.
That weapon, the way the rule is worded, it wounds things on a 4+. So the +1 to wound is going to mean that your poison attacks are also basically 3+ poison attacks, which that's awesome
that's solid
for turning on a horde unit. So I guess, is it worth 110 points to have a toughness 6, 9 wound vehicle that could be giving up victory points to take it down, that only puts out 2d6 shots or 2 shots or 2d3 shots at a not the best option for each specialty in the codex? I don't know. But if you go whole hog, and if you're like this, I'm committing to this, like I'm bringing this team of versatile mobile gun platforms, and I'm gonna put them all in one slot so that I can pay for the custom job once, there may be a use for it. So I don't know that it's instantly the garbage unit that it kind of feels like it is at first glance.
Okay.
And coming to that conclusion was from comparing it to what are the orcs normally capable of, or what is the normal theme and feel of the orcs. And generalist non-specialty units is not really the orcs thing.
Yeah, that's true. It's very true.
Because even their green tide hordes, they're specialists. They specialize in swarming with close combat buckets of dice.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like a specialty, but it is one.
Right. Right.
And so I think its value is that it's one of the few generalist units in the codex. And if you're going to capitalize on that tactical flexibility, I think it's worth a look. But standard dogma would say avoid this unit like the plague. You can find tons of reviews online that say this is a complete, the 10% point increase we saw from 8th edition to 9th edition firmly put the Rocket Truck Squig Buggy in the trash can. There's tons of negative reviews of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's driven by dogma. I think that's driven by, what's my points per wound ratio?
Yeah.
Or just simply, well, the Megatrack Strapjet or the Shock Jump Dragster are just better, so I'm just gonna use those and not even look at the other options.
Yeah.
It comes down to how are you going to use it, and how are you going to capitalize on its strengths. So am I running out to buy 3 of them? Maybe not. But I will admit, if I play Orcs on Tabletop Simulator where I can try something out and not necessarily have to invest the money until I see how it plays out in game, I wouldn't be surprised if an Orc army on Tabletop Simulator had a couple of these to play test. I'm curious. I'm really curious how it'll play out in reality. But I'm not sold that I cracked the code.
Sure. Sure.
The unit just may struggle too much, but that's my take on the Squig Buggy.
Interesting. Very interesting. I'll maybe we'll have to bust that out and try that out one of these times. But
it'd be interesting. Yeah, I'd be game for that sometime.
Yeah, but we are out of time for today's episode, so I think we will wrap it up here.
Yep. We hope you enjoyed our kind of our overview of how we look at things or how we make decisions when it comes to our own armies and how we would advise people to look at things. And if you have ideas about things you'd like to hear us talk about, or if you want to kind of let us know what stuff in the last few weeks where we talked about starter army lists, or we challenged each other to come up with how to examine these 2 data sheets, just tell us what you think about the content we're doing. If you have any ideas or things that you liked, things that you didn't like, you can comment here on YouTube, or you can join our Discord and talk to us there. We'd love to hear your feedback and any ideas you have for things you'd like to hear us talk about in the future. Yeah.
And if you liked what we did here today or liked our other videos, please make sure to, like the video, give us a share, just whatever we can to spread the content. We'd love to, would love to reach out to the community and really get a dialogue going.
Absolutely. I think there's like a red button that says something.
Yeah, subscribe, I think, is the thing, and maybe there's a bell icon. But if enough people click subscribe, I might buy a Rocket Truck Squig Buggy. Ooh, oh, I like this. I like this a lot. Everybody, start clicking subscribe. I want to see this thing.
Yeah. But no promises, TM.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Well, on that note, I will say we will sign off for now, but we will see you all in the next episode, and stay safe out there.
Thanks, everybody.